Welcome to UC Santa Barbara. We have a fabulous community here of film lovers, and we heard lots of cheers that the film ended. It is such a beautiful film. Tell me, how did you come to this project, and how did you even begin to start thinking about how to represent ancient Dahomey for these important characters, this important story?
I mean, I think I approach every project and process in an openness to discovery and a critique of the things that we observe. Because in my experience, what we first stumble upon is the beginning of a thread that you pull into an answer that rings truer. And what I mean by that is when we go into 1823, we are pre-photography, and we are through the lens, by and large, by colonial entities. We have writings from French and English that had visited the kingdom. We have illustrations that are almost comically offensive, that are for publications back in the countries of these colonialist entities, in service of an agenda. So if your agenda is to dehumanize people in order to justify in your eyes for your people the harshness and brutality of which you are inflicting upon them, the way you will depict them will toe that line. So I'd observe these images and know clearly that they often were not even drawn by people that had visited the kingdom, and you'd throw those in a pile. And then you'd see additional images where you could see an energy that felt as if someone was sitting and observing and drawing from that, and you put that in another pile. And then once you'd separate these piles, you start to look for patterns. Can I observe in these backgrounds depictions of a world over and over again? And the more I observe that, the more confidence I get in it. Then I go to the journals. There was, back in this time, almost anthropological texts written where everything is described. So pre-photography, you would write the description of every detail, from the thickness of the sandal to the movement of a shoulder, a pattern that you would see. You would write these things over and over. So if I could see a written description that painted a picture and then turn to my pile of illustrations, my period illustrations, I could vet what I'm seeing and seeing written with the illustrations that I'm looking at. Then I take it another step further, which is in the early 1900s, we start to get our own first photographs from the kingdom. And those photographs now will also show the pattern that I've been building on. So now I've got a pattern written, I've got a pattern illustrated, and I've got evidence of that pattern continuing in the form of a photograph. And then eventually dealing with people and listening to them tell you their stories, those traditions continue to exist. So through that, you start to feel what you could imagine and believe it actually looked like. And oftentimes you'd move down a path with confidence of something that you could imagine that pattern and that path leading you to, only to discover the evidence after the fact. But the evidence shows you that you've now captured the vibrations on a level that you had anticipated the next step, and that step was true. So there's a beauty in that process of discovery that is exciting. It was a very long-winded...
No, I love it. It's exciting to talk to a production designer, because these are things that, this is one of those films that you really appreciate, and you're looking at the detail. I was looking at everything from, the shine on the actress's muscular skin and the way their hair was braided, the way that their clothes were tied, to the sound, to the rich set. And I couldn't get over, I think it's striking because we're not used to seeing actually a complete, interior life of a Black world, including an African world at this period. and you gave us such a sense of place. And I almost had an anxiety about it because I was worried about it being destroyed, which it ends up being in the future, to this precious time. But I was drinking in like every crevice in the wall that you created. Oh, there's a shelf over there. Oh, that's interesting. It's a double shelf. Look what they use that for. Oh, this is a hole for light. This makes sense over here. And the sense of space that you created with columns, with texture, with the building materials. Can you talk about what it was like to build that palace? You started to talk about these, having to work off of these drawings and then the interpretation of the colonial gaze. Tell us what it was like to kind of build the space and the kinds of things you thought about and brought to bear in that work.
And just to catch people up to production design, what I like to say now is, because it's easier for people to understand. I feel like even my own family members aren't always clear about what it is that a production designer does. And it's simple to say, oh, they're a designer, but then you're like, well, what is that? You mean like an art director? Because art director sounds easier. You're like, oh, they direct the art. I kind of get the understanding of that. So I would say, to make it clear, there are 3 key positions in a film. Oftentimes, the first one that starts, or always, is the director, but the first additional person that'll start will be the production designer. And the production designer, I like to call the director of design. So you have the director, you have the director of photography, that's the person that captures the light and records it on a camera, and then you have the director of design, and that's the person that designs the whole world that you're looking at. So in a period world, sometimes it's easier to understand what that is because you realize that none of that exists, but on any film you watch, that is the case. That director of design, that production designer has made choices to discover those locations that tell your story, or has created a room that speaks to the child or the woman or the human or the man or the elder, of the vibrations of the history of their life. The story of a water stain tells you about a human's interaction with their space. The paint that goes over the water stain, because they're taking care of their space, but that water breaks through again, tells you a deeper story. That's someone taking care of their space, repeatedly painting over the same water stain. That's a story of love, even though you have the hardship of the leak. So that is the amount of detail a good designer is embedding into the worlds that they create. That's the thought. That's the thought process that allows us to feel the vibrations of humanity through the environments that we find ourselves in. When we go into this, it's crazy, it's immense, because you're like, where do I start? We don't have enough.
Oops.
It feels like as we know in the Western world, we do not spend enough time appreciating spaces like this. So there's the burden of wanting to do justice by the people that we're representing that deserve to be observed and respected and cherished and listened to, and to honor that tradition, so to be aware and respectful of the things that people imagine about themselves and their history. So there's that. And then there are the artifacts that we can dig into, and the pieces of the culture that now exist in museums in Europe that we can access. But for me, I love it. So I love the research. I love digging through, finding these patterns. Once we discover the patterns, we start to put the building blocks together. And then we develop the kingdom. There's depictions of the kingdom that I had found after doing my first pass of the kingdom and was like, woo, we got it. And that's the most exciting thing, because you're channeling a vibration. I said this before, but it's true, because I'm passionate about it. You're channeling a vibration. When you get the vibration right, you can anticipate that creation. So I can now create through the lens of the materials of which we imagined they had, and create something that, through the vetting process, proves to be correct. So even when we're doing sci-fi or something like that, imagine finding the vibration and the history of whatever you're digging through to create that future, and then doing it so right that your patterns create a laptop in Star Trek Next Generation, and then you see laptops all over the place today. You create an iPhone on Star Trek The Next Generation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our ability to believe and create is the thing that people turn to and the path that they follow in their creations, from Steve Jobs to Bill Gates. I know that's a bigger thing, but that's the importance of feeling and touching the energy of human beings through their physical spaces. And so that's what we do. So now we put those pieces together. We start to create a first pass of the kingdom. One of the first things I did was create a whole map of how all the places you see in the film would have existed in proximity to each other and in proximity to Ouida, and how we could imagine traversing to all those places, and then what is and all of the elements of that. So Ouida, for example, that was another can of pain and suffering and interest. The palm plantation is fascinating because that process that you just peek upon is a true process of which is continued in parts of Africa today, and a beautiful process.
Okay.
That earth, the cob, that material, that earthen material, I saw walls that were 1,000 years old and still standing.
Wow.
That were fortified with the excretion of termites that has a waterproofing effect. That some elder observed a termite mound not breaking down in a winter storm and realized that breaking it into pieces and mixing it with the cob was too hard because it was too strong. So they took grains and put it on top of a termite mound, so when the termites ate the grains, they excreted. And that excretion had a waterproofing effect. So now we take those grains, we mix them with the cob, and you create these bricks, earthen bricks that can weather a storm.
Oh, wow. Did you experiment with that process to see how to approximate that kind of look with your own materials?
That's those discoveries are the patterns of which we will never do. So our process of creation is seeing the outcome of those beautiful things, understanding the where and the why, and some of that instructs, like, when we see a wall, is it broken down near the bottom where the water interacts with it? So there's the story of the environment and how that degrades a space, so we can observe those patterns. But to do the process right, no, we don't get to have the joy of creation in that way.
That would be really cool.
It would be cool.
Could be experiment.
But it's that joy of discovery that gets us all excited. So people in my department, those are the things that get us excited. When I sit and talk with a scenic that's aging a wall, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a story. We're talking about the hint of green because that moisture got moss that started to grow there. Right. And you might observe and say, I'm not sure why it doesn't feel right, but now you have to analyze it. So when you look at the other research and other pieces of reference, you discover a new pattern that you missed. And all you had was the water stain when you were missing the moss. And I keep going back to that water stain as a metaphor, but it's a way of which we look at the world that allows us insight.
So you were very detail-oriented and wanted to be historically accurate as much as possible. Did you play a bit and have any room for like a kind of fantastical aspect in the set at all? Or was there really kind of pressure to be as close as possible? And I'm just thinking about the kinds of ways that another film that showed a different kind of production design set in Africa, thinking about Black Panther and Wakanda Forever that got a lot of attention for the design of spaces, which were allowed to be much more futuristic, borrow from different aspects of African aesthetics and architecture to make this mishmash, imaginary Wakanda. But you were doing something very different that seems to me that you're expressing that there's a sense of responsibility to the history and the people of modern day Benin, to present what life was like at that moment in a very respectful and honest and accurate way.
I think to me, it's beautiful. So what I'm seeing is beautiful. And if you feel that, then you see it. in all of these things. So we do have an obligation to make a cinematic film. So some things will be adjusted to photograph well. So what you're trying to do is capture the energy that you feel in a cinematic way. So if you walk into a space and it makes you feel a certain way, but you photograph, you take a picture of that space and you don't feel that, then you need to change the space in order to elicit the feeling of the space. So that is a value. But the balance of accuracy, I think the heart is the thing that needs to be the most accurate. So in that film, we see for the first time, I think in a Western film, people sleeping on the floor with pride in a way that you do not question it. In my research, you discover that the best thing for your back is a hard surface. Sleeping on a floor is better for your back than a soft bed. We hurt ourselves with the choices we make now as a Western society. In a tall, straight chair like the one I'm sitting in now, that's worse for you than a short stool. Or sitting on the ground, we see people interacting with their world in these ways in that film. And it's not created in the form of spectacle in the movie. You just accept it. You just accept that is a beautiful way to live your life, and I think that that's super important. How you carry things on your head keeps your spine straight. That is a beautiful way to carry. I see someone who weighs 70, 80, 90 pounds with 150 pounds of stuff on their head. And the ability to do that is a beautiful thing to watch. And so those truths are super important. I think when we create and we see that beauty, every glyph in the movie has importance and significance. Every shelf that you imagined has importance and significance.
Yeah.
Our discovery of voodoo, not our discovery of it, but our rediscovery of the practices that still continue to exist in Benin today. But our honoring of it is the first time I've seen a depiction like that in Western world, where you're not projecting negativity on the spiritual practices of a different culture. You know, we're all familiar with how the depiction of voodoo has been portrayed, and this time we get to honor the beauty of that. In front of Nawi's farmhouse, you see these mounds, and the mounds, Nawi's farmhouse is fascinating, by the way. That's Tata Samba, which is these intricately, beautifully made farmhouses. But in front of each farmhouse, there are these mounds. And I had seen the mounds, but I wasn't sure what the purpose of the mounds were. There's also voodoo sculptures, and that represent different things. I came to understand in Benin that inside each mound was a sculpture. The way you activate the sculpture is by reconnecting it with the earth. And I really love that, because in Western culture, we take spectacle and show the world this is our possession. And people even travel there and buy those sculptures to put on their wall as a possession of spectacle. But in spiritual practice, the value of it is to reconnect it with the earth. So you bury it and you charge it. You are not decorating for decoration's sake, but you are allowing the energy of that creation to connect with the earth around you. So those practices and those principles, you know, I was a kid just being taught and doing my best to listen to a tradition of these elders that is so beautiful, and much of which I think we would benefit greatly from observing and reconnecting with.
Beautiful. I want to ask about this film really shows Black women in complex ways that are really, for me, really moving, really stunning. I felt really emotional watching the film, found myself cheering, crying, going through a lot of the emotions. The design that you've created around these characters and how they move around the space, I think facilitates that emotional journey for the viewer. Could you talk about how you thought about this film as presenting Black women characters and how you designed for them?
Well, Gina is a force. Gina Prince-Bythewood,
the director,
is our beautiful leader. and an incredible mind. She's been in the game for a long time. I think one of her first jobs was as a writer for A Different World. So she's a legend in her own right. And she was the force of strength for us all, and the clarity of vision. And one of many beautiful things that she did with that film was shine a light and center around black women, which shouldn't be so revelatory. It's only revelatory because it does not happen enough.
That's right.
But to watch beautiful, strong black women assert themselves through all the diversity of the different types of women that we see, who all share a complexion but are very different from each other and yet love each other and come together in humanity and beauty and complexity to live and love, and is beautiful. I remember we were shooting and it started to rain, and we had all the background out in the middle of the kingdom, and in the middle of the rain, all of the background who were playing a goji started to dance in the rain. And all of these background were African people, and they started to just love the rain. And while the AD departments tried to usher them out of the rain, they just danced and danced.
Wow.
And Gina was watching that, and she realized that celebration of life and love and movement was important. And so those moments in the film in which you see that were strengthened by those real life moments in which we were watching people interconnect and celebrate in that manner. So Gina's ability to observe and to see and respect and shine a light on was cherished by us and was important.
I think that's part of what makes me so frustrated about Hollywood and the lack of attention or celebration of black women directors is striking. There's never been a black woman director win at the Oscars, and many people were very frustrated that this film particularly didn't see major nominations. The hashtag is #OscarsSoWhite that came out years ago, and it's still useful. I think that that's part of the frustration, is that on my part as a film scholar is not being able to see enough of those kind of complex representations of black life, including black women, men, queer people. I was happy to see, a range of characters represented there, and also other kinds of representations of black manhood. I think that we've been really tied and confined in terms of how men are represented. I also think it's interesting that white people are so marginal in this film. There's kind of just very much black background characters, except for this one Portuguese man who, we love to hate him and glad to see him go. It was interesting to be part, given your background work in a film that really displaced whiteness and, worked at really rethinking representation and, as it is often tropes in Hollywood and black film history, we've seen so many tropes repeated again. And sometimes when we make our own films, we end up being attached to some of the same narrow presentations.
I think there is something really big and beautiful about this film in that regard, because we often get stuck in recycling oftentimes the stories of pain and suffering, the same stories over and over again, and centering around the same things over and over again. And to make a simple shift where you say, this story is about strength. All the other things remain true. The Dahomey Kingdom was complex. They were slavers. These are not wholly good people. The Greek people were not wholly good people. The Roman people, 1/3 to half of the population was slaves. I was just in Rome. In Rome, the historian who's guiding me, I asked him about the slave system there, and he said the average age of a slave in Rome was 17 and a half years old. So these were children. Everybody's history is complex, and that is a portion of it. And then in addition to that, there is beauty and love and companionship and all the things we see in that film. I think that is special and brave to decide that we're going to observe a complex history of strong and still observe the strength and the beauty and the love of those people. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think we are accustomed to seeing the same depictions over and over again, and so starved for strength that when we see something like this, it feels so fresh and beautiful to know, to be reaffirmed of the thing we already know, that these women we just saw are beautiful and complex and collaborators on a system of which is wrong. And I think as Americans we can observe some of those things in ourselves, for sure.
That's really interesting to think about, the fact that a major Hollywood film was so decolonial in its framework and pushing back against these things. And I also think it's, as you're saying, a lot of the work has been on, U.S. American imaginings of slavery, and usually around a central character who is a slave who's trying to, emerge out of that. That's usually where we often go. Of course, thinking about Birth of a Nation is like the first major, film in history, like with complex editing, was one that went to that very same story. This is an American, not just like a black film thing, but an American film thing, to return to these sites of like trauma, and particularly the one of slavery. And I think this, going to Africa as a diasporic gesture to think about how the story expands. It crosses oceans. It's also transnational. It involves Brazil, which actually had, multiple times the population of slaves. That more than 5 million slaves were exported to Brazil, for example, much more than double than the United States. So this is a global story, and it's also, in terms of Hollywood, a foundational issue that's usually been warped. So I'm glad to see the seriousness and the care in which you brought to your craft. And this makes me want to shift and ask you, how did you become a production designer? How does one become a production designer? And what was your journey to
well, before I answer that, I will contextualize the movie a little bit. So when we find, when we're watching the film, the 1823, at that point, slavery had been outlawed in most European countries. So the guy we see who's coming and participating in the slave trade is Brazilian, Portuguese Brazilian.
They didn't outlaw until the 1880s.
Yeah, so Brazil is still practicing the slave trade through a guy who still has a huge lineage in Benin, a guy named de Souza, another Portuguese Brazilian man who lived in Benin on the coast of Ouida. So yeah, just wanted to put that in there because part of what I was saying in that history, and when I'm discovering things, that's what I discover is on one page you'd have a negative depiction of Dahomey written by English visitors, but then if you fast forward to the abolition of slavery in England, now the focus has shifted, and the focus has shifted to these people have great resources, how great are they to work with? So then when that shift happens, look how great their roads are. Look how benevolent these people are. Look how tolerable their food is. Look how, so you're watching the version of history and depiction of human beings shift to align with whatever the agenda is that's being sold or propagated back home. But for production design, I think you probably see in me, a great interest in our world building. And so having that, however you come across that, and you'll find production designers with very, very different stories, but all the stories are a gathering of information to satiate that interest. And so for me, I went to film school but I don't feel like it was clear to me in undergraduate work what a production designer was or the importance of that. I think we all stand in line of like arguing about who's gonna be the producer or the director or the cinematographer, and then somebody getting left with editor. And you forget that there's more to creating a world than that. And fascinating that we forget the world. That in that conversation, the thing we would live out is the damn world that you're supposed to be in doing all this.
Yeah.
And
So we do take that for granted, the world building that you're so key for.
Yeah. I've been in situations where people keep repeatedly asking, well, how did you find that location? And you could answer that by saying, well, that location was in South Africa and we were recreating Western Africa there. But what they're actually saying is, where did you find that kingdom? And you're like, well, we didn't find the kingdom. We made the kingdom. But for me, I went through a lot of living in Brooklyn and living in New York and getting by on top ramen and canned beans and enjoying my life anyways. Yeah.
Some amen corners over there.
There it is. But you just loved, and when I reflect on that time, I'm not more happy now. You just love where you are and enjoy the path long enough that the path takes you somewhere. So in the process of that, I worked in wood shops and I designed auctions at Christie's Auction House, and I did storefront window displays on 57th Street and designed those windows and took Mont Blanc, spray painted rocks gold and took Mont Blanc pins and elegantly figured out how they were best displayed on this micro level, observing design and creation. And then eventually a producer friend of mine, I'd actually given her first job as a PA many years before. And she was returning to New York to do a photo shoot. And she's like, you do the window displays, you're basically building a set. Come build a set for the photo shoot. I said, sure.
Yeah, it's small scale world building.
Did a bunch of photo shoots and then that led to commercials, and commercials led to all the things that I do now. So I say it found me. And I kind of begrudgingly went back into the industry because I had decided the industry was not for me. At the time that I started in the industry, there was no diversity in the industry. All the years prior to moving to New York, I worked in Los Angeles, and I did not have anybody to look at and say, that's proof of concept. That's seeing that person means that I can belong here. I didn't have access to that. With a couple exceptions, Johnny Simmons, who's also a professor at UCLA and a cinematographer. He was one of few. Malik Saeed, another incredible cinematographer. So Arthur Jaffa, another incredible cinematographer. And then, of course, the legendary Wynn Thomas, who is the first black production designer. He was the production designer of Do the Right Thing and Malcolm X.
Wow.
And so there were a handful of people, but literally the people I'm naming were all of the people. It's a little bit better now. It's not much better. So I begrudgingly went back into the industry with an understanding of the thing that I felt like I could control, which was the art department. So I could control it in the way that I could create a world of which could have me there. I could create my own proof of concept. I could inhabit a space and surround myself with people that were diverse and appreciated diversity. And so we've made some progress, but it is a path.
What's being done to increase diversity behind the scenes in the craft art trades, for film now? I mean, there's a lot of discussion about inclusion writers and commitments to diversity, but interestingly, there's also this backlash against diversity across the country, inclusion. We saw in Texas, actually, moves recently at the University of Texas to dismantle DEI. I'm wondering, is there still a lot of resistance to, bringing people of color, BIPOC folks, into these trades and to these spaces to work with you?
Yes, so I would say a lot of change has been made, and it's we were definitely heading down the right path. But we'll see
Yeah.
if apathy sets in. So we had a cultural movement, the biggest protests in the history of the world, is to my understanding, where unified protests of Black BLM supporters all over this world. And that was a beautiful thing. And people listened to that. We live in a system that responds to money and viewership. And so we do have power. And people saw that power being exercised, and they adjusted the system very, very quickly to show progress to the wants and needs of those people. But if we get complacent and we get too tired to participate in the little that people were doing, like changing their boxes on Instagram to black, they can't even be bothered to do that, or whatever the thing that might be demanded of us to show that we have allegiance with some version of change. If we get so complacent we do nothing, I do not trust that even the little progress that we've made will be sustained. So, we stay vigilant, and ideally we continue the change that we've seen, and we grow it. And when I talk about diversity, for me, my crews are diverse, and so that is important to me, is accessing true diversity. So I'm not talking about just a people or one person. I'm talking about a diverse group of human beings. And I'm not talking about just race. I'm talking about socioeconomic history. Where do you come from in the country? Do you not come from this country? Are you an immigrant, or are you from here? Like, give me a world, give me a whole room full of people that look like the world, and I'll be a happy person. And I'll be learning the most in that space, which is important to what it is that I do.
That's fabulous. Yeah, for that world building, we need a lot of different views of the world, and I'm glad that you said that about thinking about diversity more broadly. This is part of the argument that we make in feminist studies, film studies here, that we need to look at every kind of view, every kind of cinema, every kind of perspective, including the ones that aren't taken seriously or looked down upon, from fan fiction to porn to all kinds of cinema. I could ask you a million questions. I wish we could keep you, but we have to let you go. I know you're back to another set tomorrow morning. Let's thank Akin McKenzie warmly from Santa Barbara.